He's
One.
one
There you go. Okay.
Okay. We're here with Galina, and she's one of our own members, which is so great. And her book, The Hill of Secrets, is our book this week. And her book hit the debut novel #1 of new releases in historical fiction on Amazon. So
Wow.
that was amazing. I thought that was really great. And she's had short stories performed at NPR and has been published in several magazines. Galina has a BA in media and anthropology from Hampshire College in Massachusetts. She received her MA in literature from Bar Ilan University in Israel. And Galina was an international journalist for more than 20 years in Israel, England, the Netherlands, France, and Mexico.
Wow.
And she worked for Reuters news agency for 20 years. And then she worked for the Harold Greenspoon Foundation in Springfield, Massachusetts. In 2005, Harold Greenspoon asked Galina to help start a PJ Library, which is a book program for young children, and set up a similar program in Israel. And over the next 12 years, under Galina's direction, she headed the program and distributed books in Hebrew and in Arabic, and gave away over 20 million books to children and their families. And the program reaches 85% of the children in public schools in the country through a partnership with the Israeli Ministry of Education. And I thought it was interesting. You had mentioned in an interview that I saw that you distributed the books to schools because the mailboxes were too small in the homes. That's interesting. And so then you decided to retire and write this novel that you had been working on. Galina has a website, galinavromen.com, and you can find like recipes from the book, questions, the glory buns that Sarah made are on there, the recipes on there, and a playlist, and even a section, which I thought was cool, that you can challenge her on facts. So if she wrote something in the book, you can challenge her. So she has to back it up that. So quite the introduction. It was a long one. Galina, you've done so much. So
Thank you. You've done your homework too, I see.
I did. Well, there is quite a bit out there, and it is so interesting, your whole path. And we'll get into that about your path through publishing and how you decided on this book and the subject. So, okay, is everybody ready to hold their books up?
All right, hold your books up.
Let's try to get it in the frame here.
All right, 3, 2, 1. All right, we should be good.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So, Galina, I read that you conceived of this novel after reading a paper by your friend and who was also a professor of yours about scientists and wives of Los Alamos. And that was more than 20 years ago. And then you wrote a short story for your MA, which then became a chapter in this book. So how that all developed, and then which chapter was it?
Well,
My first
what happened when so I had this idea for a very long time, and then I applied for this MA program in creative writing at Bar Ilan University. They have a program in English creative writing, even though it's in Israel. And I told them my idea, what I wanted to write about, and they said, that's fine. And then the first day of classes, they said, oh, well, you're not allowed to submit chapters of a book for workshopping. You have to submit short stories. And it was like, oh my, I almost left the program. So I decided, then I remembered that Amy Tan, when she did her first book, it had started as a series of interrelated short stories that her agent then told her to turn into a book. So I said, it was good enough for Amy Tan, it'll work for me too. So that's when I decided to submit it as short stories. The only chapter that survived was a chapter with Sarah being tracked by the G2 guys in Santa Fe. That's the only chapter. That's the only short story that remained. All the other ones got axed at various times. There was one of them, I mean, the issue with writing historical novels is that sometimes you get so carried away by the research that the research gets in the way of the book. And so I had like one of the chapters that got chopped was one when they had a rabies outbreak among the dogs and of pets. And Groves in Washington ordered all the dogs killed at Los Alamos. And several of the scientists said if my dog if my dog can't stay, I'm not staying. I'm leaving the project. And so they found other accommodations for that. But it was such a good story, but I couldn't figure out when in various, as I was writing the book, where to stick that in a way that would work without sort of distracting the reader with side stuff. But that was like one of the fun stories to write, and it was really based on actual research, but it went, that was one of the ones that was axed. So there were a couple like that.
And I think Deb had a question about the character development.
So very often they tell you to write about characters like write about yourself and all that kind of stuff. I actually really like writing about characters that are different from myself. I found the most challenging character to write was Jimmy, because he was so far from me. I mean, he was, he was a guy, his socioeconomic background, the whole thing was like, had very, very little to do with me, and that's fun. And the most challenging, so I do that with a lot of, Christine also doesn't have a lot in common with me. The German Jewish refugee family has a lot more. My parents were European. They came to this country when I was a toddler. So I grew up feeling their how strange they felt about it. I mean, in terms of the characters, my father's not at all like Kurt and my mother's not at all like Sarah, but Gertie is not that different from my teenage self. This kind of like, I lived in a household where my father, when I was a teenager, asked me how many bases there were in baseball. So he'd been living in America, I think, for about 10 years at that point. So they didn't quite fit into America. And I think Gertie, much more than I, was really bent on becoming American. She really wanted to fit in. She really wanted to kind of throw off her parents' baggage from Europe. But I think that experience, some of the observations that Sarah has about life in America and the things that are strange to her are certainly things that my parents found strange. So that was the part that that I, in some ways, was closer to me than the other characters.
What about the art connection with
That
Sarah
was just,
and
the art connect. What you mean about Maria Martinez, or you mean
well,
about or Christine's interest in art?
her interest in art and then the connection with the Potter?
So I had to figure out what the heck is Christine going to do. She needs to find herself, but the job of a novelist is really you create a problem and then you solve it, right? You make life as difficult as you can for your characters, and then you try and then you get them out of it. That's kind of how a plot moves forward. And so I had to find something for Christine to do, and I really kind of fell on Maria Martinez, and I said, aha. Okay, here's this Potter. And she was actually already quite famous in the 40s. She came into her own in the 20s. And but it was like, oh, okay, so this is like, that's my solution. So it was really, it was a problem looking for a solution, and Maria was a solution in that sense. And I did a lot of pottery as a teenager, and I really love pottery. And so that was easy for me to be enthusiastic about, and how she felt about the pots. And and so that's kind of how it came together. I really had to find, you know, what you're going to do with herself. I mean, her problem was my problem, basically. So that's
And
how
you
that.
were able to see some of her work in person,
Yes.
right?
And the most amazing thing is that I have a neighbor who was a teacher, and I had asked her to look at my manuscript and sort of go over and do some copy editing on it. And so she asked me for a hard copy. She wanted it all printed out. I printed out to her. She brings it back to me, and she says, "Be careful." And look inside. And inside was the manuscript and a piece of Maria's pottery.
Wow.
Turned out that her father had been at the Los Alamos Boys School before it was taken over by the army. It was his, and he had bought some of Maria's pottery. So there I was, like, actually holding a piece of her pottery. It was amazing.
Oh, that is.
And so we used that. She's in my community. So when I did the book launch, we sort of showed this piece of pottery, as well as pictures of some of the more, you know, famous stuff. And then I went to visit another friend of my mother's, and she also had a pot by Maria. So she is really you know, pretty well established, and her pots are in the Smithsonian, and I was very lucky that I happened to be visiting a friend in Washington, D.C. when there was an exhibit of her stuff at the Women's Museum in Washington, D.C. So that was like, it helped the descriptions.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Were you able to interview any of the wives that were actually there in Los Alamos?
No, I didn't interview. I was like, at this point, most of those people are really, you know, in their 90s, and I wasn't sure
Yes.
how reliable that would be. And I was not living in the States at the time. I was in Israel, which made it even more complicated. And there are very, very, very good oral histories. So that's what I mined a lot of that stuff. You know, there are reports from, like, kids who were at Los Alamos, and they had and there's the scene where Christine sees the pot at Opie's house. And I had made up that scene, and I had no idea whether Oppenheimer had any pots by Maria. And then in the oral archives, there was an interview with a maid who cleaned the house, the Oppenheimer's house. And she said, I used to like the days when I cleaned the Oppenheimer's house, because I saw my aunt's pots there. And so it was like, oh, wow, bingo, you know, it was really true. It's like, I made this up, but it was really, you know, he really did have her pots. And I relied much more on the on those archives than I didn't do any interviews. I also didn't seek out Maria's family, because I did there is some anthropological ethnographic films of her you know, firing her stuff. So I looked at those. So the descriptions of her and how she moved and what she wore and all that came from those films. And but I didn't actually go and interview the family. I wasn't sure how they would feel about it. I was like, I didn't know what that would stir up. Like, they'd like it, they wouldn't like it. I didn't want to, I sort of left it alone, and just, you know, went on what was sort of public information, if you will.
Okay, thank you.
And I had a question too about the age difference between Gertie. She was only 16, and then Jimmy was 23, and everyone seemed to be happy with this and push it. I mean, was it more common in the 40s? Because now, when my daughter was 16, I'd be like, you're not dating someone 23. But they were all so happy with that relationship.
I think it was much less of an issue, frankly. I mean, my grandmother married at the age of 17, and she married somebody who was more than 10 years older than she was. And so I don't think it was, you know, it's very interesting that, because they have now these cultural sensitivity editors. And so that editor was like, well, you know, she's underage. And so I looked at what was considered age of consent. And she wrote me that like in the 1930s, she found evidence that was 16, and in the 1950s it was 18, but she wasn't sure what it was in the 1940s, and maybe I should change that. And I'm thinking, like they barely kiss, and she's
Right.
pushing herself on him. It's not like he's exactly
Right.
exploiting her. So I resisted changing her age, and I wanted to give the sense that he's I couldn't make him that much younger with
Mhm.
the experience that he comes to the project with. I would have
Right.
I would have had to have made him like not have had his master's or anything. He would have been like right out of college. So I couldn't I originally he was a little older, and I made him 23, was like, like is kind of the only thing that sort of made sense. But I do think that age differences, that there were greater age differences, or they were more common than they are today. I don't
Mhm.
know how uncommon they are either. I mean, I have quite a lot of friends who have, and my parents, the age difference between my parents was 8 years. So I don't
My
know how,
parents were 10 too.
excuse me?
My parents were 10 years difference, but
So
it was older. Like she was 24, he was 34. And so it was just the 16 I wondered about. But even before that, people were getting married so young. I just didn't know what it was like in that time period.
yeah, I don't think it was unusual for that time period for
Mhm.
somebody to have like a steady boyfriend, and the assumption would be in many cases that she would get married at 18, except that she was college bound. If she hadn't been college bound, it was pretty common, I think, to get married at 18, 19 around then.
Mhm. And was Jimmy real? His
No,
character, he wasn't based on a real
no,
person?
he's not based on a real character. The accident is based on a real accident,
Okay.
but
Oh,
the
really?
character is not.
That
Yeah.
was awful. Oh,
Yeah, it's an accident that happened after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mentioned that in the historical notes at the end, because I couldn't help wonder if that terrible accident that happened afterwards, and actually the descriptions of how much he suffers are actually minimized compared to what it was really
Mhm.
like. But and I wondered if the scientists involved had seen the destruction firsthand before the bomb was used, whether they would have um, felt differently about its use, or about the degree to which they objected to its use. It wasn't like there was no objection, but they might have, I wonder how it would have affected them if it had been before. And so
Mhm.
that's why I allowed myself that change.
Jamila?
Yeah, Galina, I was just wondering, all your research for like the scientists and what happened at Los Alamos, like how accessible was government information to you? On the historical records or what was happening at the site,
I didn't go into a lot of it. I mean, it really is the domestic side. So most of the things, I mean, there are a couple of really good books about, Rhodes has written there are a couple of really good books, and I was very leery of the science because I don't come with a strong science background. So, I really didn't get into it that much more than what is very much the historical record. I mean, there's nothing in there that was even ever, I think, like under wraps and recently released documentation when it comes to that
Look, the
side.
scientists writing a petition not to use the bomb wasn't, that's true. Yeah.
True, that's true. Um, and Oppenheimer not allowing them, not being willing to pass it on to Truman.
Wow.
He didn't. But the bottom line, there was really only one scientist who left after the Germans surrendered, who sort of said, I'm out of here. This is
Mhm.
not what I signed up for," and actually left the site.
Right. I think that's what Kurt had said, if it was used against a Nazi, he was okay with it, but then, when it was
Well, they thought that the Nazis were developing one, so they wanted to make
Right.
sure that they had something to either preempt it or to respond to it. And in fact, it turns out that there was a nuclear program, and under Nazi Germany, but it was minor. And it was minor because Hitler didn't want to put resources there because he thought he would conquer Europe before the bomb was ready. So that's how that's how sure he was of himself. So he never gave it the kind of priority or funding that the Americans had. So the Germans weren't even close. But the guy who was running the German program was somebody that many of the scientists at Los Alamos knew him personally, and some of them had studied with him, and he was considered quite a genius. So they really had a good sense of who they were up against, and they were scared of him because they knew how good he was.
Great. Thank you.
And then I thought it was interesting when Owen told Gertie later afterwards, she said, why did they drop the second one? And he said it was a different kind of bomb. They probably wanted to see how it worked. Is that something that you found, or is that just kind of supposition?
No,
Like,
there is evidence that Groves, there were a lot of the whole issue of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There is more and more classified documents emerge. It seems that it had much more to do with concerns about the post-World War II era than it did with defeating the Japanese. In other words, a lot of the military was actually against the use of the bomb. Groves wanted it, Oppenheimer's boss in Washington, and I think he was the one who really did want to know whether it worked, whether both of them worked. So he was pushing from that end. But the real concern was that the Russians, it had been agreed with the Allies had agreed that the Russians would invade Manchuria to help defeat the Japanese. And once Truman knew that the bomb worked, and he found that out at Potsdam in July, he didn't want the Russians to invade to get any credit for the defeat of the Japanese, because that they would want the bounties of war. They would want their just rewards for having defeated the Japanese. So this very much influenced both the timing of both bombs and what the sequence of events happened. That Hiroshima happened. Within 24 hours, the Russians declared that they were going to invade Manchuria. That happened so the 6th of August, Hiroshima happens in the morning. On the 8th of October, the Russians declare that they're going in near midnight, and a couple hours after midnight, on the 9th, they begin invading Manchuria. And a few hours later, the Nagasaki happens. Okay, so that to make sure that the Japanese surrender as fast as possible, as decisively as possible, and so the Russians can't claim any real part in the Japanese surrender. When in fact, the fact of the Russians coming in scared the Japanese silly. I mean, they were really, really afraid of the Russian invasion. So Truman was he wanted the Russians to threaten to come into Manchuria, but he didn't want them to actually advance in Manchuria. And he was very much influenced by his Secretary of State, James Burns, who said, if we use this bomb, we will have a lot more leverage over the Soviet Union after the war, because they will know that we have this very powerful weapon, which the Russians actually knew anyway because they had spies at Los Alamos. So, but this was at the time that Hiroshima happened. The situation of the Japanese was that they were being blockaded. They didn't have food. They were eating acorns at that point, and they didn't have fuel for their planes, so they couldn't really mount any kind of counter to aerial invasion. And the assessment of the military was that they were about to surrender anyway. And they had, in fact, sent envoys to Moscow. The emperor had sent envoys to Moscow to try and get feelers about possibly surrendering. And the Americans knew this because they had already intercepted all the encrypted Japanese communication. So they knew that the emperor had sent this delegation, and they wanted to make sure that they wanted to be a decisive victory that was due to them. due to the
Mhm.
Americans. And so that played a very large role in the whole thing.
Galina, I've heard some of that, but I also thought that the military in Japan was not supportive of surrendering.
This is true. There was definitely, the Japanese were known to be extremely ferocious fighters, that they fought to the death. And that, you know, basically you committed harikari if you, rather than surrender, you killed yourself. And there were indeed elements in the army that did not want to surrender and tried to, in fact, block the emperor's announcement of surrender. They tried to steal he had pre-recorded his agreement to surrender, and they tried to steal the tape, like to make sure the tape wasn't played.
Wow.
And so there was indeed an element, but the position of the emperor is so critical in Japanese society, and he's a semi-deity, that I think he would have carried the day eventually. And if the emperor decides something, he would have had the overall support for the decision. They would do what he said, basically. But yes, you're quite right that there were elements within the army that were not interested in surrendering.
Thanks.
Were you tempted to throw a spy character in there?
I was. So the closest I came to that was the incident with Feynman. Being that they tried to fine him for not putting. There's a scene there where Kurt tells Christine that Feynman left some papers out that he was supposed to put in the safe at night,
Yeah.
and he got fined. And then he told him, you shouldn't fine me because all the papers, all the information there was wrong. So if there's a spy, they get all the wrong information. That actually is true. That's a true incident. Feynman was really quite a prankster. He would crack the safe that had all the papers in them that they were supposed to be hiding, and leave it open so that the guys, the security people, would see how stupid their measures were. But yeah, it was tempting because there was Kurt Fuchs, who was Karl Fuchs, who was the lead spy, and he was apparently a very charming guy. He babysat for a lot of people. He was, you know, a single guy, and quite well liked. And I think people were extremely surprised when it turned out that he was a spy. Yeah, it was tempting, but again, the thing is that you have to make your choices about how do you not clog up your plot with too much going on. So that was so that
And
didn't.
also, can you talk a little bit about your road to publishing? Because you had mentioned before that it was difficult to get your first book as a debut, new author, over 60, to be published.
Well, I was very lucky with an agent. I mean,
Mhm.
the first agent I sent it to took it, and she was pretty determined. And it's really, you know, at some point it's kind of like finding a husband, because it's like you only need one. It's got to be the right one, and then it's okay. And the book went out to like 27 different publishers, and you get this not quite right for us, this is weak, da 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 da. Everybody was giving her different reasons. And then there's the editor who goes, I can't believe you sent me this novel. I love it. It's so wonderful. I couldn't put it down. It's like, yes, okay, great. So yeah, and she was really wonderful. I mean, once the book, I went through a lot of angst between the time the agent took it and until somebody published it. But once it was in a publisher's hands, it was very smooth sailing. I mean, I had incredible editors. I mean, the fact checking and the copy editing was just mind-boggling. I had I would have a song, and the copy editor would say, yes, well, the song was indeed a hit, but not by the group that you have singing it on the radio. I mean, or the
Wow.
picture that Christine and sees in the Metropolitan. The reason I have a historical note at the end about that is because the copy editor said it's true that the Cézanne is in the Metropolitan, but they only acquired it in the 1960s. On the other hand, there was a an exhibition by some other painter. She who also did landscapes. So maybe you could switch the painting by Cézanne to one of his because Christine might have seen that temporary exhibit at the Metropolitan. I was like, oh my God. And I didn't want to change it. I like the Cézanne. I wanted to keep the Cézanne. So I said, okay, I'll admit the mistake and I'll admit the inaccuracy in the historical notes, and I'm going to keep, in journalism, they say don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. So I decided not to let this fact get in the way of the good story and kept my Cézanne. But she was just, I said to the acquisitions editor, I said, I don't know, I wouldn't want to room with this person, but she's an incredible copy editor. So yeah, very picky, but really picked up, saved me from very embarrassing mistakes. So.
And then the cover. So did you have a say in the cover art, or?
Very little. It's like they send you this very elaborate author's questionnaire. They ask you to point out, 3 covers that you really like, that you would like them to imitate. So I said I would like the colors to be dominant orange and yellow of the Trinity test, because that's what people associate with it. And I would like it to be a graphic cover and not a photographed cover. And it was like nothing that I suggested actually happened. But they essentially blithely ignored what I was interested in, and they let me choose the font essentially. But that's, basically they said to me, we understand marketing, you don't, let us do our thing. If you go on Goodreads, you'll see the book was translated into Hebrew, and the Hebrew publisher did a cover which was much closer to what I had in mind. That was like, when he took it, his first thing was, he said to me, we're going to change the cover. I said, good. So, but I think, it's a genre cover. If you look at historical fiction novels, the amount of covers of women facing away towards the distance, it can be in Tuscany or in Paris or whatever, but it's really become kind of a cliche, I have to say. So it is what it is. I can't complain about sales, so maybe they knew what they were doing. I don't know.
Nice cover.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine.
It's a nice cover. And do you want to talk a little bit about the nuclear policy since then, that is developed since then?
Yeah,
and
well,
what
there are
are
a
they
lot of-
doing at Los Alamos today?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. One of the things that happened was that Truman decided, because once the army, there were actually 2 more bombs that were ready to go that they could have put together and used, and Truman decided that it wasn't a good idea to let the military decide these things. So he said, here forthwith, no atomic bomb will be used. It's the exclusive decision of the president to whether or not to deploy a nuclear weapon. And that has remained American policy to this day. The president is the only person, the US is the only person to decide this. And there have been quite a few presidents, including Obama, who sort of said we should change this, because quite a few presidents, when they sort of discover, and that's also the history behind the football, that there's this briefcase company, the president, everywhere he goes, and that has the codes for launching a nuclear attack. And a lot of presidents, including most recently Obama, I don't think Biden got into it, but said that it should be, this is a crazy thing, that it's just the president without any consultation. But none of them ever changed it. So that is still American policy. And it is the exclusive decision of the president. He doesn't have to consult with anybody. And there was a situation under Nixon when he was during Watergate, he was very depressed, he was drinking a lot, and at one point he was very frustrated, and he said to Kissinger and Schlesinger, all I have to do is go into my office, pick up the phone, and 50 million people will be dead. It was like, oh my God. And one of them, and I'm not sure which one, because Schlesinger, when he was asked by his biographer about this, didn't deny it and he didn't confirm it. But one of them did contact the command and say, if Nixon calls you, call him. Like, don't just listen to him. So that's a vulnerability, I would say, that we have as a country. But what happened after the whole issue of whether to share the information with the Russians, with the Soviets, was a big one. Oppenheimer and a lot of the scientists at Los Alamos were in favor of sharing the information as sort of to make sure that they saw that as a way of preventing its use in the future if its power was understood and known by the other side, if you will, that it would be easier to negotiate its non-use. Truman and James Burns were extremely against that. They were much more hardline, and they thought that they would have kind of a 10-year exclusive control of this weapon before the Russians caught up. Because of the spies, in fact, the Russians by 1949 did their first nuclear test, and so that advantage really didn't materialize, and in fact, I think intensified the Cold War rivalry. Now, nobody would say Stalin was a nice guy and that everything would have been hunky-dory had they behaved differently. We don't know, but that certainly. And then in 1960, there was this big effort by the military to come up with a strategy for nuclear weapons, and they put 1,300 people to research it and come up with a policy, and they brought together in this bunker in, I think it was Nebraska, all the who's and who of the defense establishment, and they revealed this huge plan, and the plan was called mutually assured destruction, which is that if the Soviets would launch a missile, we would retaliate and immediately kill something like, I don't know, 500 million people, some of whom would be Chinese because the Russian missile sites were near the Chinese border, and everybody except one person said, "Good job, guys, this is really great," and one guy said, "Is this really the best we can come up with, that our strategy is like, if we're attacked, we're going to kill 500,000 people?" And that has essentially the concept of mutually assured destruction, that our safety lies in the Russians knowing that if they launch an attack against America, the retaliation will be such that everybody will be destroyed in the world. So don't try. So it's the acronym is NAD, which is a very acronym. The amazing thing is that in fact it has kept the world relatively safe, but it's a very, I don't know, it's not a great thing to depend on, that just because we can all kill each other several thousand times over, that makes us safe. Because the biggest fear today of defense experts is that we could start a nuclear war by accident. Because America's policy, and that also was determined in 1960 and also has not changed, is that we launch on attack. Launch on warning, not on attack. In other words, if we have knowledge that a missile is coming in, and the assumption is that they would attack silos, like missiles that are in silos, they're standing like, sitting ducks in 5 states in the West, that we would launch those missiles immediately. before getting hit. So that like that's part of the mutually assured destruction. And that is American policy to this day. And we have about 400 active missiles that can that football that's would be, you know, put in the codes and it starts rolling. Okay. The other aspect of this, which also has been true since always, is that once those missiles are launched, they cannot be recalled. You can't change your mind. So if Dr. Strangelove, the movie where there's the president thinks that a missile is coming into America and he tells the Americans to launch the missiles back before the missiles hit. Not an impossible scenario. And then when he realizes that it's all a mistake and he says, bring them back, and they tell him we can't bring them back, also true. So that is American policy today. And what's happened is that under Obama in 2010, there was an agreement. We went from a stage where, like in 1967, there were about 70,000 nuclear warheads in the world. That has come down to closer to 12 or 13,000 in the world today. So there have been reductions. But the last agreement between the US and the Russians expires this coming February. And under that agreement, there were mutual inspections, about 18 a year. And the number of active warheads was limited. And what's going to happen in February essentially is that all those barriers go down. So it's kind of like having a speed limit that says 65 miles an hour. And sometimes people exceed the speed limit. They go 70, they go 72 miles an hour. But there's a policeman on the side of the road saying, better be careful. I noticed that you're going over the speed limit. You know, the speed limit is 65. What's going to happen basically as of February is that the speed limit sign goes off, the policemen go away, and effectively what is happening is that there is a nuclear arms race going on. The Chinese are also active in increasing the number of nuclear warheads they have. And I just saw 2 days ago, NBC had a piece about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they mentioned that they quoted an organization that kind of watches this stuff, and I can't remember exactly the name of the organization, that said spending on nuclear armaments by the 9 countries that have nuclear arms last year was $100 billion.
Wow.
And it was an 11% increase over the previous year. So there is effectively a nuclear arms race going on right now, and it's not getting that much attention. I think this week is a week when there is more attention to it because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but I think it's incredibly concerning, and especially given both the situation with Iran and the situation with, I think, even more Ukraine, that we're probably closer to the possibility of nuclear war than we have been since the Cuban Missile Crisis at this time in history. And with everything else that's going on in this country and in this world, there isn't that much attention to it, but I think we do that really at our peril. And I also think that one of the costs of for Obama to get the treaty through Congress, he had to commit the government to a nuclear refurbishment program. And that is now underway. It's a $1.7 trillion program. And somebody did the math on that and said that comes to $108,000 a minute for 30 years. And that is actively going on now. Los Alamos is very active right now in reactivating, creating the plutonium. They call them the plutonium pits. They're like bowling ball size parts of the bombs that trigger, that are part of the trigger system of the bombs. And Los Alamos currently is the only place in the United States where they can be produced. And another facility in South Carolina is under construction to also start doing the same thing so that there'll be more refurbishment. And on the one hand, there's probably something to be said for refurbishing the nuclear arms that we have. Some of the information is kept on floppy disks to this day. But the good thing about floppy disks is they're much harder to hack than later technologies. So the question is, how do you refurbish? How much do you refurbish? We're in the process of building 12 new nuclear submarines at the cost of $11 billion apiece. We already have 14 nuclear submarines. Do we need more nuclear submarines? The question of whether these silos make any sense is one that is really, everybody knows where they are, the missiles, the land-based missiles. And it's also what the football is about, right? This football and it's not clear why we need those. Like the submarines and bombers could probably sufficiently destroy the world without the silos. So there hasn't been, I think, a lot of strategic thinking about how the strategic landscape has changed when you don't have two superpowers who are the only ones in the game, and when you really have 9 nuclear powers in the world, and where the chances of a nuclear war being started by accident due to a computer error is probably greater than Russia actually deciding to send a missile to the United States. And it's not clear to me at all from what I've read that those are seriously the focus of the money being spent on the rejuvenation. Like how much is going into preventing hacking, cyber attacks, mistakes of that kind? Because there have been over the years about half a dozen situations where there were false alarms, and they were stopped in every case by some human being saying, wait a minute, either this doesn't make sense, or I'm not going to report this higher up yet, or something like that. And Gorbachev, for example, purportedly had a statue of a goose in his office because there was a situation where the Americans interpreted a flock of geese as an incoming missile. And that's the real danger. And that's where we are today. I mean, and this is without any relationship to the Golden Dome, the Trump's Golden Dome. This all predates him, and the $1.7 trillion doesn't include that. So that's where we are. So it's really, I'm sorry to be like, it's not, this is not a happy story, but I think it's one that it's important for people to understand that we have not really changed our basic fundamental strategy since 1960. A very different world.
Galina, I put in the messages, I put in a link to the Stockholm International Peace Institute. They keep, I think that's might have been the people that you were saying that keeps track of all these things, and they had an update on the nuclear risks, and it echoed a lot of what you discussed in there.
Right. I think they specifically also mentioned the fact that in the US it's one person who makes the decision, right? I think that was one of the things that they said that needed to change, and a lot of the other aspects as well.
Well, they're very worried about AI as well.
Yeah.
Losing that human, thinking to stop this, craziness before it gets out of hand type of thing. So that and the fact that there's been so many technology updates with the quantum mechanics and quantum physics and everything, that it really is changing the risk factors as well, because it's just much more it just makes everything much more capable.
And I think there's another aspect to it, and I do encourage you to read that statement. And in the context of what I think you'll understand more of what the statement is saying. on the basis of what I've sort of explained, it'll make more, what you're reading will make a little bit more sense. I have seen that statement about a week ago. The other thing that kind of dominates nuclear policy is this idea of parity. That if the Chinese are now trying to like semi trying to catch up with the amount of nuclear warheads the Americans and the Russians have, and the Americans and the Russians have always tended to have about the same. But the whole thing is kind of crazy because like during the Cuban Missile Crisis, at that time, the Russians had 500 nuclear warheads and we had 3,000. And the fact that we had 3,000 and they had 500 didn't really matter because we could have mutually destroyed each other perfectly.
Yeah.
You know, the 500, the 300 was sufficient to totally destroy the United States. And you don't need to necessarily have parity. So if the Russians want to keep their land-based silos, that doesn't mean that we need to have the same amount of land-based silos as they do. We could have, you know, a more, you know, we could depend more on our submarines. And so this idea that you have to have the same number as the other side, you know, if you can kill yourselves, you know, once you can kill yourself 10 times over, it doesn't matter whether you can kill yourself 1,000 times over. So that's another aspect of the spending that are not really taken into consideration.
Well, I won't sleep tonight, so. But I do want to ask too, before we close here, I want to ask what's next for you, Galina?
I don't know. It took me so long. I've been encouraged to write a sequel, and I think I might visit Gertie in the 1950s, but I'm not sure. I mean, I have to say that this took so long. It was like, and I have found it very difficult to sort of get going on another project. The other thing that troubled me was I started to write it, and the first chapter, Gertie lands somewhere and she's wearing the wrong kind of shoes. And I was saying like, wait a minute, is this like your first chapter is always going to be somebody with the wrong shoes? I mean, like, you gotta think of something else to write about. So I don't know. I'm not feeling very inspired right now to write. I hope that I get my act together, but it probably will end up being a sequel. That's probably the direction I will be
It
going.
would be interesting to jump into the Cuban Missile Crisis from where you started into this is what it had become by the 60s.
Yeah, maybe I hadn't sort of thought of that. I was actually going to take her to the I was thinking of taking her to Israel in the 1950s, and to the creation of sort of what was going on there, because there aren't that many historical fiction books that really deal with that period and that place, and in the context of everything that's going now. That kind of intrigues me, and at the same time it horrifies me. So I haven't figured out whether I'm really going to do that. So I really don't know. But one of the things I sort of did want to end on a little bit is sort of what happened to these scientists afterwards. And it really there were most of them stood by what they, you know, stood by their work and were proud of it. There were a few that really regretted it. Oppenheimer didn't say that he regretted that the use on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but was very much opposed to the use of the hydrogen bomb. Edward Teller went on to produce the hydrogen bomb. There were some that really said it shouldn't have been used in the first place. It really sort of, they didn't, by and large, did not have a very large role in what happened afterwards. And it's interesting that, you know, they do the science and then the politicians decide what happens. And I think that's true also with AI today. People who are very excited about AI, but we don't know what it's going to lead to, and we don't know how much the inventors of it are going to have a say in what happens with it. And I think that's a very sobering kind of issue that I think scientists really need to face. And I do want to ask one thing for those of you who please do me a favor and rate the book on Amazon or on Goodreads if you've read it. It's hugely
Done.
important. It's what my editor really looks at. And if you are on other social media, if you can, give a shout out for the book, that really helps. I think, especially given that I'm not very well known. I know Helene has done that a lot, and some of the others as well who are on this call, but it really makes a difference. Sometimes I can see a little blip in sales, and it's usually because somebody has said something good about the book somewhere on social media. So I would really ask that you do that especially if you like the book. So. And even if you didn't, you're allowed to, rate it anyway.
And if you didn't, just shut up. Let it go. Well, we're so happy to have you, Galina.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thanks. It was a good one.
Anybody else is coming to the Berkshires other than Helene, then, give us out.
Sue,
Okay.
my sister Susan. Sue will go next year, right?
Yes, we will be out next year.
We're going to be out there in the next year. So I'm
Right.
coming this year with my family, and then Susan and I are going to come the next year.
Great. So you're invited.
Okay, good.
You must be touring also, Galina, right? Aren't you touring?
I'm doing, I do a lot of things by Zoom, and I'm doing things in the Hudson Valley, and I'm planning to be in the Miami area in March. So if anybody wants to, from March 9th to 18th, I'm going to be doing a bunch of lectures. But if you heard me today, then you don't need to come, because it's based. I'm talking a lot more. What's nice about this group is that when the most talks, it's to people. If it's not a book club, it's people that have not read the book yet. So it's a different. It really does focus on what's happening today and what happened after the war. So anyway, thank you so much. Really, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night.